I have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Hugh Rollinson. Hugh is the course director for the Faraday Institute, and also you contributed a chapter to the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it's a great pleasure to be able to interview with you so that readers can perhaps get to know you a little more and get to know a little bit about your interests, in addition to what you've already shared in your chapter.
Fine.
So I think a good place to begin, Hugh, is if you could perhaps share with us a little bit about your background, where you were born and brought up, maybe early family life and education, please.
Yes. Well, I'm a Yorkshireman, and so I was born in York and educated in York, and my family all had lived in York for several generations. Right. And so I was in York until I was 18 years old, and it was during that time that I began to develop my first interest in geology.
Mm-hmm. How did that happen? How did that come about?
Well, it was very interesting, actually. I mean, you never realise at the time, but as a little boy at junior school, I think I must have been going out into the countryside with my dad, looking at caves and rocks. And my headmaster in my junior school realised I had this interest. And one day he presented me with a box of fossils. I must have only been about 11 years old. And that's actually what got me interested. Later on, when I went to secondary school, it was one of the few schools that taught geology at A-level. So from quite a young age, it was my intention to do geology in my later years at school, with a view perhaps to studying it further.
Mm-hmm. And coming from Yorkshire, did you find that a particularly geologically fertile environment to explore and develop this interest?
Yes, well, my dad was a Yorkshireman through and through. There was nowhere in the world like Yorkshire. Even when he went to the Himalayas, he still related it to Yorkshire. And so we would go out on family trips and outings to the Yorkshire Dales and other parts of the county. And yes, there were lots of interesting and actually quite different rocks to see on the coast and in the moorlands and so on.
So your dad, was he a geologist?
No, he was a civil servant and latterly developed an interest in books and became a bookseller. But he just had a love for the countryside.
Right. So that was your lead-in to geology?
To scientific life, yes. Yeah.
And how did you develop that academically as you went to
Well,
school?
I studied at school, and I was very fortunate to be in a small group with enthusiastic school teachers, and they encouraged me to apply to Oxford. So I got a place in Oxford, and I studied there for 3 years, and that really then set my foundations for a career in geology. And typically one would go from a first degree on to study for a doctorate. In my case, I chose not to, and I went to work for a number of years. I had a job in the Geological Survey of Sierra Leone for nearly 4 years, and then came back to Britain and then studied for my doctorate. So I did things in a slightly different way from many academic colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your chapter, which is on climate change, which we'll come on to a bit later, you make it very clear that you have a Christian faith. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us how you came to embrace that and what it meant to you, particularly as a geologist?
Yes, well, my family were very strongly Christian, and so I grew up in a very open Christian environment. And was nurtured in that environment. And I don't think there was ever a time when I felt I couldn't embrace the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. But as I grew older, I found that it was making sense. And as I suppose, grew up, my faith kind of grew up with me, so that as a sixth former, I was very involved in a Christian union in the school. As a student, I was very involved in student Christian activities, and it's always very much been part of my life and also part of my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Now, very often today we hear talk about there being conflicts between, particularly geology,
Yes.
and theology, if you like.
Yeah.
Was there ever any such conflict that you encountered in your own personal development?
Yes, of course. I mean, as a teenager, I read quite a lot about how we might reconcile our understanding of the Bible with scientific information. And for many, many years, I wrestled with the different options that were presented to us as ways of understanding the book of Genesis. And it was probably not until I was sort of mid-career that I'd actually settled on a way of thinking that I was comfortable with, and had developed a set of views that I felt were my own and not just inherited from something I'd read.
So up until then, sorry, would you say you were living in two different compartments? How did it work?
Not really, because I was comfortable with both. I was comfortable with my scientific understanding, and I was deeply committed to faithfully reading and following the Bible. But I think it took me a long time to be able to reconcile the two totally, and be willing to speak about it and even give talks about it, you know, because I was confident in myself that I had a good understanding of the two.
Now, one of the aspects of your geological interest is the age of the Earth.
Yes.
And of course, when it comes down to Christianity in particular and science, there are big conflicts there.
Yes, yes.
Can you share a little bit with us, for the benefit of those who are scientists and the benefit of those who are Christians, how you help resolve that particular conflict?
Yes, okay. I should perhaps just give a little bit of background, because my scientific interests developed in a direction in which I was looking at some of the very oldest materials on Earth. When I worked in West Africa, the rocks there were extremely ancient.
Now, can I just stop? Sorry, Cynthia. How do you know they were ancient?
Okay. We use the methods of radioactive age dating. And when I first started doing my fieldwork, some of those methods were not very well developed. But some of the early work had actually been tried out on rocks from the African continent, which was very interesting to me at the time. But rocks I was looking at in Sierra Leone, we now know, were between 2 and 3 billion years old. When I came to do my PhD, I ended up working on rocks of a similar age, and then I had the opportunity to work in other places of the world. Some rocks almost as old as 4 billion years old. So I've worked on old rocks, and therefore understanding them and understanding the methods we use to date them has been very much part of my scientific career. I've only ever been involved in 2 actual dating projects where I've actually done the chemistry and the calculations myself. But we use the methods of radioactive age dating, which in my view are most robust and in fact quite intricate. It is a whole science in itself to try and understand the way in which we date rocks. There are many, many different methods. And broadly, they give us comparable sets of results when we apply different methods to the same set of rocks. And so I'm confident that the methodology that we use in this science, we call it geochronology, the methodology we use is robust and well developed.
And then as you pick up your Bible and you open it at Genesis 1 and 6 days and so on, how do you interpolate, as it were, your science and your theology at that point?
Well, I look at the science, which I find totally convincing, because I've done it myself and I know people who do this work, and I don't believe they are out there to mislead us. And then I turn to my Bible with a traditional understanding that the earth was formed in a short space of time over not very many thousand years ago. And I'm left with a dilemma. So either I ditch my science, or I ditch my Bible, or I find a way of reading my Bible which allows me to reconcile my science with my Christian understanding. And that's the direction which I've followed.
Now, in your work, that's taken you to various places
Yes.
in the world. Tell us a little bit about the cultures you had to interact with, any of the challenges or encouragements, if you like, that have come through doing your field work in different cultures.
Yes. Well, I've had a couple of periods in my life when I worked in Africa. So my first job in West Africa. Later, I had a university position in Zimbabwe. And in many ways, they were just very enjoyable experiences. You know, there are parts of Africa which are just amazing, and to do field work in the African bush is just an incredible experience. And to go places where people have never been before. About 15 years ago, I took a job in the Middle East and worked there for 6 years. And I suppose in some ways that was more challenging culturally, because I was in a very different non-English speaking environment where the dominant worldview was Islamic. And so doing geology in that environment was a bit more of a challenge. Colleagues were extremely supportive. The students were really a joy to work with, but the pervading culture was one in which it was more difficult to be openly a Christian, but not impossible. And so in some ways that was more of a challenge. Also, I had a managerial job. I ran the geology department for a number of years. And so as an expatriate working within a foreign culture, I always had to be aware that I was a guest in the country where I was working and may not therefore have the ability to change things in the way that I may have wanted to do.
It's interesting that you had that perception or that conviction that you were a guest. Just turning a little bit to the moral aspects, if you like, of your interest. And I know we've had conversations about this before concerning mining.
Yes.
And your work there.
Yeah.
Can you say something about the moral dilemmas as you perceive them from a Christian point of view that are pertinent to the mining industry, if you like?
Yes, yes. Well, in West Africa, I worked in the diamond mining area. In Zimbabwe, my work was linked with some of the work that mining companies did, mainly for nickel and for chrome and for platinum. And these are commodities which are in huge demand on the world stage. Mining companies, the multinational mining companies, have a lot of power and the ability to change and do things which may go against the sensibilities of the local culture. Recently, I was in Ghana and listening to Christians there talk about the mining companies that worked in Ghana. And it made me aware how much mining companies can tread roughshod over local sensibilities, ignoring people's view of who owns the land, for instance, which is a very big issue in the African continent, and aware that sometimes the drive for profit goes beyond a care for the local people. Mines do good things because they create work and they provide education and healthcare in sometimes quite remote places, but sometimes the overall motive, if it's driven by an economic drive, which it always is, can lead to quite bad consequences. And of course, if the price of a commodity drops, then a mine will just close, and then suddenly people are out of work. And there are quite important social consequences as well.
Finally, turning to your chapter on climate change, what was it that turned your attention to climate change? You haven't turned away from geology, but you have turned towards climate change. How did that happen?
Well, it's an interesting story, actually, because I read a review of a book written in the late 90s about climate change, and the reason I was drawn to it was because it was written by somebody I knew of. He'd been a geologist when I was an undergraduate. He'd worked in academia for about 10 years, and then he had gone to work for Greenpeace, and he had completely switched sides in geology from working for the oil industry to working against it. And I saw this name and I saw the title and I read the book, and I suddenly realised that the issue of climate change is something that we as geologists tend to be quite knowledgeable about, particularly from the way in which climate has changed in the past, but which is actually much more than a political issue. It's a deeply moral issue, and that's what he brought out in his book, where he talked about some of the big climate change negotiations that took place in the 1990s. So I began to give lectures about climate change to my students in the university where I was working, and tried to raise awareness of the fact that as geologists we have a sense of social responsibility in this area, and it is something that we should become engaged in. When I worked in the oil-rich Middle East, I also tried to do this and tried to get my undergraduates to appreciate the dangers of an oil-based economy and the ramifications for that globally.
Now, how did that go down, both with your students and with the oil-rich countries?
Well, in the UK it was fine. In the Middle East, it seemed to go down fine, but of course you never know, because people are often very polite and they won't really tell you what they think. But I think what I hadn't done at that point was connect my scientific understanding with my Christian understanding, and I think that has come more recently as I've begun to think about the Christian mandate for why we should be concerned about climate change. And not just treating it as a moral issue. And so that aspect of my thinking has evolved much more recently.
Hence your chapter.
Hence my chapter.
Yeah. And in the chapter, what comes over very clearly is that the climate change issue is a climate emergency. Is that how you really see it? And if so, why?
Well, I am not a climate change professional. My interest is in Earth systems, and the climate is part of the Earth system. So it's part of the bigger scope of things that I'm interested in as an Earth scientist.
Right.
And therefore, I have to depend a lot on the literature. But there are papers that have been coming out in the last 2 or 3 years by reputable scientists, climate modelers mostly, who are publishing in high-profile journals such as Nature. And they are saying that given the data that we have at the moment, our models suggest we don't have very long before we're going to get to such a point that climate will be irreversibly changed. Already it's irreversibly changed, but we will get to a point at which things start to happen in abundance which will scare us. So there will be more in the way of forest fires, heat waves, storms, torrential rainstorms. These kind of things are what we are expecting as a consequence of the climate, the Earth's climate getting warmer and warmer. So we're now nearly at 1 degree warming. By the time we get to 1.5 degrees of warming, we will be getting to a point where things are going to be very noticeable. So I'm dependent on the literature, but I see these warnings many times made by reputable scientists, and so that's what drives me.
Now, I notice on the bookshelf beside you, you have a photograph of Greta Thunberg.
Yes. Well, it's not really a photograph, it's just her little book which came out, which came out quite recently.
Was it helpful?
It's very interesting. It's a series of talks that she has given at a number of different high-profile gatherings, like the UK Parliament, for instance, and so on. It's a bit repetitive, but it's passionate. And in some ways, the simplicity of the passion captures something which I think many other people are feeling and expressing. So in that way, yes, it is helpful.
Now, she certainly captured the attention of young people
Yes.
People of her generation.
Yeah.
Others would say, well, she's perhaps over-egging it, creating a sense of unnecessary panic.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Well, it's not wise to panic, but I think she's raising awareness where maybe those of us who are older and wiser daren't go. She's got enough youth and energy and life before her, and maybe naivety, to grasp one of the biggest problems that we face as a human society at the moment. Those who are deeply embedded in the world of politics and business have so many other burdens to carry. This is one that they just is one too many they cannot bear. But she's right, I'm convinced she's right. And we need this fresh vision of somebody young who sees things in an uncluttered way to remind us that this is such a priority.
Yes, because those who are going to suffer most from this are not your generation,
No, absolutely, no.
but hers and the generations
Yes.
afterwards. And those who are suffering already are those in the low-income
Yes.
countries.
And that's the scary thing, that as climate change brings adverse effects to our weather and so on, we in the rich West will be able to protect ourselves probably for a long time to come by buying our way into solutions, whereas those people in the southern hemisphere particularly will struggle to do that. They don't have the resources to protect themselves, and they will suffer.
Thank you very much, Hugh.
Thank you, Roger.